In the Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Dragon God build. This is a build that focuses on the use of Dragon Communion spells and uses a new item to further boost the damage of these called Rock Heart. So Rock Heart is a consumable item that you can use infinitely, and essentially in order to get this item you need to go find the painting that's located in Shadowkeep. It's located not too far into it. I think you just need to get past the Golden Hippopotamus boss and then go down the ladder there, and you can kind of find it in a little room under a bridge area. Once you've found the painting, then you'll need to go up to the Jagged Peaks area of the game, which means you need to go through Dragon's Pit, and there is a boss fight there. Go through that, and then ride up to the mountain and find the spot on the painting, which you can see in this video, and then you'll have the Rock Heart item. So this is not a very difficult item to get whatsoever. You can get it pretty quickly if you know how to get it and start using it. So the way this item works is it operates like a consumable, and you'll use it from your consumables bar, but you can't use it while you're wearing armor. So you'll have to take off your armor to use this, and once you use it, you'll turn into a dragon. You'll notice your resistances increase, and you'll notice that you have a flat 10% damage negation across all damage types. And one of the extraordinary things about this is that you weigh 0. This weighs 0 when you're doing this. You have 10% damage negation for wearing 0 weight. So this works really well for builds that want to use the Blue Dancer Charm. The Blue Dancer Charm only boosts physical damage, so you'd have to keep that in mind when doing this. But if you want to play any sort of light build that's taking advantage of the Blue Dancer Charm and very low equip weights, this is a good item to use in that build. I'm not saying it's the most optimized for every build, but it definitely should be in consideration. So then once you're in dragon form, you can use the consumable again to give yourself a 1-minute buff that increases your Dragon Communion spell damage by 20%. And that is a huge amount of damage. So you're going to get that added buff on top of like all your other buffs in order to deal damage. And that of course stacks with Roar Medallion, which now boosts Dragon Communion Seal since a few patches ago, and also the Dragon Communion Seal, which boosts Dragon Communion spell damage as well. So you're going to have lots of ways to buff damage here. Now from this point, you can go a couple different ways with this build, and I'll explain the way I went, but you could certainly do it a different way as well. So what I've done here is I've focused on using the Dragon Communion Seal to cast my spells, cranked Arcane up a bit and Faith up a bit in order to meet the requirements for some spells, and kind of went the Arcane route. Now, there are pluses and minuses to this. The advantages are that I don't have to use another seal, right? Because if you're going the Faith route and you decide to just put the Dragon Communion Seal in your offhand and crank Faith, you'll actually have higher incantations scaling to cast these spells, so they should deal more damage, but you'll need to hold the Dragon Communion Seal in your offhand in order to get that extra damage boost from it. So the major upside of that is obviously higher damage per spell cast, and you'll see my damage here is already really high, so you'd have even higher damage, so you could go that way. The downside to that is that I have a weapon and Dragon Communion Seal when I'm going around on the landscape, and I can just cast a spell with L1 or attack with R1, and I don't have to swap back and forth. Now that might not be a problem for you if you don't mind swapping back your seals back and forth while you're in combat, you know, fighting enemies on the landscape or in dungeons. Then going the Faith route makes a lot of sense. But if you're, you know, just wanting a little bit easier playstyle in terms of not having to manage your inventory as much, and you like also prefer having bleed, because I have a bleed weapon here that's set to the occult affinity because we are pumping Arcane, then you can go that route too. So I not only have the damage for my Dragon Communion spells, but I also have a bleed option. If you go Faith, you probably won't be using a bleed weapon. So for weapon here, I'm actually using a new weapon called the Blood Fiend's Fork. What I love about this weapon is that it's very lightweight. It has good reach. It has native blood loss buildup on it. It has arcane scaling by default. When you go to a cult, you get decent blood loss buildup. You have decent damage. And frankly, it's just there when I need like a backup weapon. This is like a primary caster build. You know, we're not trying to like go for maximum melee damage here. I'm optimized solely for Dragon Communion spells. If you wanted to, you could pick a different weapon with more damage and more weight, etc. But what I like about this is it's very lightweight, so that when I'm using the Blue Dancer Charm, I still have relatively low equip load to get more out of it, and this weapon also does 100% physical damage. So what Ash of War you put on the weapon here isn't super important. You can pick any that you like. I find that Sword Dance works very well. It tends to kill one enemy in a use for a relatively cheap FP. So that's not too bad. You could use Braggart's Roar, this one I messed around with that increases like stamina recovery and damage, but the thing is I noticed it doesn't actually boost your damage negation when you're in dragon form. I don't know if this is a bug, because there were quite a few bugs pre-launch in terms of the way things were working, so it's possible that Braggart's Roar might get patched. to give you damage negation while you're in dragon form later. If that's the case, I definitely think there's a case for that. But you can basically go with whatever Ash of War you want here. So then I have the Dragon Communion Seal in my offhand. If you were going the Faith route, you would have, probably like the Erdtree Seal in your main hand, Dragon Communion in your offhand, and your other weapon in your like backup slot in your main hand, and you would cast from your main hand. So armor-wise for this build, we're not wearing any armor because we're using the Rock Heart. So you don't need any armor for this build because you can't use armor with this item. So when it comes to talismans, there are a few ways you can go, but first let's talk a little bit about the Blue Dancer Charm. The Blue Dancer Charm is going to increase your damage the lighter equip load that you have, and it only boosts physical damage, so keep that in mind. And this also applies to your spells that deal physical damage, and Dragon Communion spells have quite a few spells that deal physical damage, so that's very optimal here, and it happens to work out that our Rock Heart doesn't weigh anything, so we're natively very, very lightweight. So spells like Exike's Decay, or Dragon Maw, Dragon Claw, stuff like that, all have their damage increased when you're lightweight when you have the Blue Dancer Charm equipped, so it's going to boost our weapon attack damage and our spell damage, which is really nice. Now, you definitely don't have to use the Blue Dancer Charm for this build. I just figured because we're lightweight anyway, and there are good Dragon Communion spells that deal physical damage, that it makes sense to kind of go in that direction, but you could absolutely drop this from this build and then use whatever Dragon Communion spells you want, because then you wouldn't have to focus on physical damage because of that talisman. I also have Crusade Insignia here. This boosts your damage by 15% after you kill an enemy for 20 seconds, refreshes each time you kill an enemy. This can apply to melee attacks and spells. You can kind of see a theme here. You want to be able to boost these things, right? Like you want to be able to boost your damage constantly, and both is better than just spells or just melee damage. Now, another talisman that I find good for the landscape, but I generally swap out like in boss fights, is the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman. That's because this is a FP hungry build, right? Like you're using tons of FP with dragon spells, and this can just slowly help replenish it while you're exploring, so you can use them regularly when fighting difficult enemies, and you don't have to worry about FP management as much. Now, here's where it gets tricky. I like to use the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman as well, because you have 10% damage negation by default while in dragon form, and that's very low, especially for the DLC when you're getting hard. So the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman is going to increase your physical protection by I think it's like 18 or 19%. Well, you have, on top of the 10%. So you're going to come out like 28, 29%, something like that, physical damage negation. And then you'll get your Skadu Tree Fragment buffs. On top of that, you'll have even more protection. And we do use Golden Vow in this build, so that will also give you even more protection. So you're not as bad as it would first seem when you're looking at this. So you might be looking at this going, where's Roar Medallion? Why do you not have Roar Medallion in this build? And I do use Roar Medallion. I use it typically during boss fights, or you can use it in place of Crusade Insignia. Obviously, Roar Medallion is not going to buff the damage of your weapon, but if you do use Braggart's Roar, for instance, and you have Roar Medallion, then when you use charged heavy attacks, it will boost the damage of that. So you could go that way as well, or you could use Barbaric Roar or something like that. Because during boss fights, Crusade Insignia, usually there's not other enemies to kill besides the boss, so it's not usually useful in boss fights, so you can just swap that out for Roar Medallion there. And Flock's Canvas Talisman is also not a bad choice. You could slot that in place of Blessed Blue Dew Talisman during boss fights to get some more spell damage. So there are quite a few talismans that work for this build. You could even use Shard of Alexander if you like using like Sword Dance or something like that to boost its damage more. There are quite a few options, and I would suggest playing around with them to see what's best for you. But I've kind of seen what you see here to work pretty good for me, and then I just shift it around a little bit during boss fights. So spell-wise, we obviously have Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength here in order to boost our damage. And with Golden Vow, you get protection too, and that's an added bonus for this build because you could really use all the protection you can get. Flame Grant Me Strength boosts fire and physical damage. We don't have any fire spells in this build, but if you were using fire spells, some of the Dragon Breath ones, you could definitely use it to boost that as well, but it will also boost the physical spells, so we have it here. And I find that I don't really buff with Flame Grant Me Strength much except right before a boss fight. That's the only time I use it. Otherwise, I'm typically just buffing with Golden Vow and using Rock Heart periodically as I move around from dungeon to dungeon and landscape to landscape in order to keep my damage up a little bit, my protection up from Golden Vow. So the three other spells I use predominantly for this build are Rotten Breath, Exike's Decay, and Dragon Maw. Now, Rotten Breath is kind of a weaker version of Exike's Decay, so you might be wondering why I have it in this build, and the simple reason is because you can use it from horseback, and you can't use the other two from horseback. This allows you to ride around in some fights and just breathe Rotten Breath from horseback, poisoning or scarlet rotting enemies, I should say, and dealing damage at the same time. If you don't have this, then you basically eliminate the ability to fight from horseback with this build, unless you're using your melee weapon, whatever you go with. Exike's Decay is a more powerful version of this spell. You can use it in boss fights to set Scarlet Rot early on. If you can, catch a boss at a good distance at the beginning of the fight, a lot of times they start opposite of you in the room, so you can have some spacing to cast this, set Scarlet Rot, which makes fights go a lot easier if you can do that. And it does physical damage as well. And then we have Dragon Maw, which has a few things going for it. It has high damage, burst damage, which is great. It has huge hit boxes, so it hits bosses that are aggressive even if they're behind you, knocks enemies down if it's hitting regular enemies, which is good. It has high stance damage, so a few casts of this will usually stance break a boss. But the very most important reason to use this skill out of all the spells, spell out of all the spells we're using, is because of the poise that it provides you, or the hyper armor that it provides you. You have 0 poise with this build, which means anytime an enemy hits you, you're going to get interrupted. But when you use Dragon Maw, you have hyper armor and you don't get interrupted. So you can still fire this off through attacks of bosses. And I mean heavy hitting attacks, it will still go off, allowing you to use this build effectively in some boss fights where you just can't get a lot of separation. And I cannot understate how powerful this spell alone is. This one spell will carry you through so many bosses. It's not great for every single boss, and you might have to adjust your strategy for different ones. But it is good for the majority of bosses in this game, and as long as you can get your protection decently, if you can get that stance break to happen and you have Scarlet Rot going, you should be able to win most boss fights. And there are a few other new dragon incantations as well. The first one is Ghost Flame Breath. And Ghost Flame Breath is effectively a slightly cheaper version of Borealis' Mist. It seems to do a similar amount of frostbite buildup. They both do magic damage. It seems like Ghost Flame Breath does slightly more damage than Borealis' Mist, and we're talking like a few percent at most. But it is significantly cheaper at 36 FP compared to 48. So if you like Borealis' Breath, and that's one that you use in your build, then you might want to consider this one, because it's just a better version of that spell effectively. However, because we're going for physical damage here, we don't really use that. And frankly, I prefer Smaragd's Glintstone Breath when I'm going for magic damage on a dragon incantation build anyway, because I just find that it outperforms Borealis' Mist most of the time. So then we come to Bale's Tyranny, and this is a spell where you kind of roar upward and do like a fire AoE around you while you have hyper armor, and it deals tons and tons of damage. It deals similar damage in my experience to Dragon Maw. It can probably potentially do more. It seems like some effects may not be buffing it properly, and there were a few bugs with spells pre-launch, so it's possible that some of those are still in the game. But again, this is a spell that doesn't deal physical damage, right? This deals fire damage. I don't have it included in this build, but if you drop the Blue Dancer Charm and you want to use this one over Dragon Maw, you can. So that is also an option. I think this spell will probably be better in future patches, so it's not one I would recommend currently, but I think it's just going to get better over time. And another thing I want to mention about this spell also is it's considered a Fire Magma spell as well as a Dragon Communion spell. It's kind of double dips there. So you can use the Dread Talisman as well to boost the damage of this spell. And then lastly, we come to Bale's Flame Lightning, which does a mix of fire, physical, and lightning damage. Kind of has an animation similar to Dragon Claw that like lunges forward with the claw and slams down over a good distance. One thing I really like about this spell is you can use it from further away than you can use Dragon Maw. And you can see these three spells all do a very similar amount of damage. They all have hyper armor, so they're all pretty good in my opinion. And I think these two, Bale's Tyranny and Bale's Flame Lightning, will get better over time. However, at the moment, I think Dragon Maw has a slight edge over these spells. I think these spells will be better in the future with future patches. And one thing I want to note, too, about these spells, if you do decide to use them in your build, which you can, is that they have very high arcane requirements. So you can't really go easily the Faith route, a little bit of arcane to use the other Dragon Communion spells that I'm using in this build. You would basically have to go the Dragon Communion route, go arcane with a little bit of Faith. So attribute-wise for this build at 165, I have 55 Vigor, 42 Mind, 25 Endurance, 14 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 30 Faith, and 50 Arcane. You don't need any Intelligence for this build. Start as an Astrologer, disregard that. The Strength and Dexterity are there to meet the requirements for my weapon. That's why I have them, because it has modest requirements. It's like 14 and 11, I think, and I started with 12 Dexterity, so I can't go lower than that. but that's just what those are there for. Then I went the Occult Infusion and pumped Arcane. Vigor is there because you need a good amount of health when you have very little protection. You could take this up to 60 even if you want to get more protection, but I was pretty high level already, so I didn't want to go too much higher for this build. We have 42 Mind for this build to give us tons of FP. Dragon Communion spells are notorious for the amount of FP that they cost, especially ones like breath spells where you can just hold the button down and empty your FP pool. So you basically want as much Mind as you can get on this build. Endurance is 25 for just stamina and stuff like that. You don't even need to have 25 endurance for this build. You could have 20 or 15 or something like that. Depends on how much rolling and stuff you're doing in combat. And it does use stamina to spell cast, but I don't find I have any stamina problems at 25. That's usually what I go with for most builds. And then for Faith and Arcane, I have basically what I did here is I went up to 45 Arcane and then 30 Faith for the Dragon Communion Seal. This allows us to use the spells that we're using and have good scaling on the Dragon Communion Seal. Eventually, you'll take Arcane in this build up to 80 and then, increase Faith more to get more scaling with this seal. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're going the Faith route and you're going to go minimum Arcane, which you would have more spell damage with these spells, but, you'd have a little bit trickier setup, you would just go up to 80 on Faith and have the minimum requirements in Arcane for the spells that you need to use. And when it comes to Flask of Wonders Physique here, I have the Opaline Hards here to give us more protection because we're light on protection as it is. You can use the bubbles here to prevent like one hit's damage or most of the damage of one hit when you first go into combat. This can allow you to like go in and fire off a Dragon Maw or Exite's Decay without taking damage from like the first attack that's inevitably coming, which I find is super helpful. And then when it comes to Great Runes for this build, Radons or Godric's are definitely the two of choice here. Godric's for stats. You use so many stats in this build. If you're going the Faith route, you might not need it, but can help alleviate some of the stat spread for this build. And Radons is also good. Health, FP, stamina, all those things are good for this build, so either of those would be the ones of choice. So that wraps up our Dragon God build. I hope you guys are enjoying this one. This was a ton of fun. It's definitely one of the more powerful builds I've made so far. We will be doing a separate video using the Dragon Priestess item that buffs Dragon Cult Incantations, so you can look forward to that. I don't know when that's coming, but I will be doing that. As always, if you have tips or questions, please leave them in the comments and I'll try and get to them as soon as I can. And if you have suggestions about other builds, leave them there as well.